the Rhetoric Prof stream in the daytime for me, which is a little unusual. Hopefully the audio on this one is better than what we had last night. There still was audio there, but it was low. So I hope that has been fixed here, but if not, I apologize for being incompetent. So, this is part 2 of a video reading series, and they'll both be up on YouTube, of reading Joan Scott's The Evidence of Experience. Last night we read the first section, which was subtitled Becoming Visible, and you can go back and check out what that was about. But I think a lot of what she was trying to say is, okay, in history, she's a historian, in history especially, but in lots of kind of academic discourses, critical discourses in general, there was a desire at the time she was writing this, which was in 1991. But I think it's still true in a different way. You know, this has developed a little bit. There was a desire to have history represent voices, groups, identities that hadn't been represented before. She says, but there's an issue with how that's being done, that it's being done through the evidence of experience that's being claimed and thought about as unproblematic, as something that is kind of transparent and clear. And she wants to, I think, complicate that, not because she wants to undo that project. I think actually because she's really invested in that project. And you can see that in her own work. If you were to read beyond this, the kind of stuff that she's done is very much in that line. But she thinks that there's some critical problems about using evidence. We have to think about what that means. We have to use it in a different way. And so this is continuing that argument. That's what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to read it and comment on it as I go, like I usually do on the stream. So history has largely been a foundationalist discourse. By this I mean that its explanations seem to be unthinkable if they do not take for granted some primary premises, categories, or presumptions. These foundations, however varied, I'm seeing I'm getting like a little bit in the red, so let me kind of adjust my volume here on the mic, because now I might be too loud. Turn it down a little bit. Okay, maybe that'll be a little bit better. Okay. Maybe go back a little bit. Okay. How's this? There's no one here to tell me, but it will. Okay, hopefully that's an acceptable volume level. Okay, sorry, back to the reading. So these foundations, however varied, whatever they are at a particular moment, are unquestioned and unquestionable. She's not talking about a specific set of ideas, but a kind of set of ideas that are placed in a kind of special box of the foundations. These are the things that can't be questioned. Those could change in time, but they'll still have that categorical feature. They are considered permanent and transcendent. As such, they create a common ground for historians and their objects of study in the past, and so authorize and legitimize analysis. Indeed, analysis seems not to be able to proceed without them. In the minds of some foundationalists, in fact, nihilism, anarchy, and moral confusion are the sure alternatives of these givens, which they have the status, if not the philosophical definition, of eternal truths. Now, it would be helpful if she gave us some examples. And right here, we might expect that she's about to, but she doesn't really give us some examples. But, we could think of some examples of how people think about history and have certain foundations in it. People would be like, well, of course it's true. What might people say about that it's of course true? It's like, well, of course it's true that there's progress. We talked about that last night. Of course it's true there's progress in history. What are you talking about? That one might be more obviously something you could criticize. Or you'd be like, well, obviously history repeats itself. Might be another one. But I think there's lots of different things that it could be, things that people would kind of take for granted. Historians have had recourse to many kinds of foundations, some more obviously empiricist than others. So what does she mean by empiricist? In some ways, that word relates to the idea of experience. It comes from the Greek word empira, which really means experience. But empiricism, as a form of knowledge, is knowledge that's coming from experience, that's being tested by experience, often in a kind of, used in the sense of a scientific kind of empiricism, that we're doing experiments on it. We're kind of going out and we're finding stuff out in the world. It's that objective part of experience that's being emphasized when people say things are empiricist. Well, there's empirical evidence for it. It's an empirical question. It means we can't just decide it theoretically. We have to kind of go find stuff out in the world. What is most striking these days is the determined embrace, the strident defense of some reified, made into a thing, that's what that word means, transcendent category of explanation by historians who have used insights drawn from the sociology of knowledge, structural linguistics, feminist theory, or cultural anthropology to develop sharp critiques of empiricism. This turn to foundations, even by anti-foundationalists, appears in Frederick Jameson's characterization as some extreme form of the return of the repressed. So I think basically what she's saying is that even the people that kind of maybe made their bones on criticizing empiricism as being maybe too transparent, too obvious, not being critical enough, even they are returning to some kind of other foundation now. Why is this happening? When she cites Frederick Jameson, another critic's idea of the return of the repressed, he's there alluding to a psychoanalytic concept that something that's repressed is going to reappear in the body of a patient as a symptom. Some kind of repressed memory, you're going to reenact it some other place. So this is a form of that happening, is kind of what they're arguing or making an analogy to. Experience is one of the foundations that has been reintroduced into historical writing in the wake of the critique of empiricism. So it's like, you could imagine it as almost like the cartoons sometimes, and the cartoons where there's like a bump on a car or something, and some character takes a mallet to it, and the bump goes down, and then a bump appears somewhere else. Right? It's like, oh, we got rid of empiricism. We critiqued empiricism. Maybe we didn't get rid of it. We critiqued it as a kind of basis for all history. Okay, whoop, pops up over here, experience. It's just like the new thing that's going to work, make it all work, come together. Unlike brute fact or simple reality, its connotations are more varied and elusive. It has recently emerged as a critical term in debates among historians about the limits of interpretation, and especially about the uses and limits of post-structuralist theory for history. In these debates, those most open to interpretive innovation, those who have insisted on the study of collective mentalities, of economic, social, and cultural determinations of individual behavior, and even of the influences of unconscious motives on thought and action, are among the most ardent defenders of the need to attend to experience. Feminist historians critical of biases in mainstream histories, right, kind of play on mainstream, and seeking to install women as viable subjects, social historians, insisting on the materialist basis of the discipline, on the one hand, and on the agency of individuals or groups on the other, and cultural historians who have brought symbolic analysis to the study of behavior, have joined political historians, whose stories privilege the purposive actions of rational actors, and intellectual historians who maintain that thought originates in the minds of individuals. All seem to have converged on the argument that experience is an irreducible ground for history. The evolution of experience appears to solve a problem of explanation for professed anti-empiricists, even as it reinstates a foundational ground. For this reason, it is interesting to examine the uses of experience by historians. So now we can feel that's where we're going next, right? Such an examination allows us to ask whether history can exist without foundations, and what it might look like if it did. So, just to let's regroup before we go into the next section. We know what she's kind of trying to do here. It's a little bit clearer. But I think, what's all this stuff about the critique of empiricism? This is one of those moments you walk into the parlor and there's this discussion that's already going on. And you're like, wait a minute, what? Critique of empiricism. Here's one kind of maybe easier way to grasp what she's talking about. There was a long tradition in historiography, the kind of discussion of how you write history, where there is an assumption that what you need to do is get archival, documentary evidence about stuff. You can't just rely on stories that people say. You got to have documents. That's the basis for evidence. And that is a kind of empirical evidence. It's stuff that's sitting somewhere in an archive. It's real physical stuff. Well, okay. You can critique that by saying well, who made those documents? Aren't those documents just another form of story? And that's part of what was happening in that critique of empiricism. But then people were like, well, what should our evidence be? And some of the people that were part of that critique of empiricism were like, well, obviously the experience of everyone matters, not just the people who can make documents. And what Joan Scott's trying to say is well, okay, but what is that? What is that doing? Are you kind of just treating that as a new form of documentary evidence? Which has the same problems? That also needs to be kind of thought about critically. Okay, so I think that's what's happening here. Welcome to the stream. We're reading Joan Scott's Evidence of Experience. So, in keywords, Raymond Williams sketches the alternative senses in which the term experience has been employed in the Anglo-American tradition. So if you're in my class, you've read one entry from Keywords by Raymond Williams on criticism. Maybe it's worth talking just a little bit about who Raymond Williams was and what Keywords was as a project. I'm not an expert on that. There's probably a lot of people who could tell you more about that, but just a real quick thing. Raymond Williams is often thought about as the founder of cultural studies. And one of the things that he kind of did, and maybe if you're in my class, communication criticism, you could say makes it possible for us to have a class in the university called communicative criticism, or communication criticism, is that he's kind of halfway between a literary critic, which there's a lot of, and he's like, well, why just literature? Why not the stuff that's on TV? Why not the stuff that, let's say, working class British people are interested in, and not just kind of supposed high culture? Anything might be worthy of criticism, or things that are worthy of criticism. We shouldn't just kind of base that because some things are liked by people who have a lot of money. Okay, that's really simplifying the argument. But in part of Keywords, what he was trying to do also was open up critical vocabulary. And rather than saying these are concepts, saying, okay, these are all arguments. All of these huge, big kahuna terms, things like communication, things like criticism, things like experience, are not one idea. They're histories of ideas that people have argued about. And so he was trying to kind of create this document, which is sort of like a dictionary written by one person, and that many people have, responded to in different ways. That puts together a kind of history of these little debates around these terms, kind of intellectual history. So this is him doing that for experience. These he summarizes as 1, knowledge gathered from past events, whether by conscious observation or by consideration and reflection. And 2, a particular kind of consciousness, which can in some contexts be distinguished from reason or knowledge. Until the 18th century, he says, experience and experiment were closely connected terms. And I believe, I might be wrong about this, in French, it's still the same word. Expérience would also be a word you could use for expérimentation or something like that. I'm not sure if that's still true. But you can see it, obviously, they're closely related, experience and experiment. Designating how knowledge was arrived at through testing and observation. Here the visual metaphor is important. In the 18th century, experience still contained this notion of consideration or reflection on observed events, of lessons gained from the past, but it also referred to a particular kind of consciousness. This consciousness, in the 20th century, has come to mean a full and active awareness, including feeling as well as thought. So we kind of move from, you could say, maybe not move from, but the emphasis moves in, when we're talking about experience, the past, things that are kind of handed down, stories, or things that are kind of observed and then capable of being handed down, to what's happening in my body right now. That's what experience is. Well, that's a historical shift that seems significant, and that might be something worth reflecting on even before we start using the term. Well, why do we, that seems to us really natural. It's like, well, what else would experience be? My experience. The idea of collective experience seems to us metaphorical. Well, that might have been the more original term. So what's happened in between? The notion of experience as subjective witness, writes Williams, is offered not only as truth, but as the most authentic kind of truth, as the ground for all subsequent reasoning and analysis. According to Williams, experience has acquired another connotation in the 20th century, different from these notions of subjective testimony, as immediate, true, and authentic. In this usage, it refers to influences external to individuals, social conditions, institutions, forms of belief or perception, real things outside them that they react to, and does not include their thought or consideration. In the various usages described by Williams, experience, whether conceived as internal or external, subjective or objective, establishes the prior existence of individuals. And so one of the students in my class, Hanson, was like, I'm confused about this stuff, like criticism. Is it subjective or objective? It feels like people are going back and forth. Well, that's a good question. That's a good kind of confusion because, yeah, it's hard to say. Is it subjective or objective? The kind of criticism I like tries to complicate that. It tries to kind of complicate the way that we would judge something to be subjective or objective. But that's part of the reason why it's maybe confusing. Because like we kind of want to understand. Like, well, are you referring to something that's empirically really true for everyone or something that's just true for you? Is it possible to have criticism if we break the world down into those two categories? When it is defined as internal, it is an expression of an individual's being or consciousness, When external, it is the material on which consciousness then acts. That's it's a nice little formulation. It's worth reading that again. When it is defined as internal, and here we're talking about experience, is an expression of an individual's being or consciousness. Well, this is my experience of the Little Debbie's Hostess. It's divine. I love it so much. When external, it is the material on which consciousness then acts. Like I'm having an experience of that. The experiences of that thing outside in the world. That's real. It's not just in my head. I experienced it firsthand. I saw with my own two eyes the thing. How dare you tell me that it's not real? Talking about experience in these ways leads us to take the existence of individuals for granted. Experience is something people have, rather than ask how conceptions of selves, of subjects and their identities, are produced. You might be like, produced by who? What factory is that who's producing subjects and their identities? The university. No, I'm just kidding. Sort of. Okay, produced. This is kind of amorphous. It's hard to say. You can't say, well, it's produced by this person. Because the thing is, every subject, every identity is produced. And it's not produced by another subject itself. It's produced through relationships, in discourse, in language, in social practice. It's hard to pin it down without looking at an example. But one way you might think about it is, if you're a student, you're like, well, that's my identity. I'm a student. But that makes a lot of sense. That kind of it seems like natural enough. It doesn't seem very problematic. But how do you know you're a student? Well, like you walk into class, you know that you don't sit at the front of the class. That's not a place for you. That's not a place for your identity. You know, like, to raise your hand before you speak. You know, like where things are supposed to be. Certain things are supposed to happen. There's supposed to be information in college on a syllabus. You know, certain kinds of disciplinary rules. There are things about being a student you have to know in order to be a student. Also, so where did you get all that knowledge? You're like, okay, learned that in school. Okay. But like, who created all that? There are also things that are not necessarily formal knowledges that are part of the identity of being students, of like how not to do your homework, how to skip class, how to make the bathroom break last a lot longer. This is also part of being a student, but it's also a kind of knowledge that's part of that identity. Well, that might not be what's valorized about the identity, but there it is. So it's being produced kind of like constantly in the very possessing of the identity and like acting it out all the time. You're also recreating it for other people. You're like justifying that knowledge that everyone has. You're like, yeah, of course, this is what we did. Okay. It operates within an ideological construction that not only makes individuals the starting point. Oh, I'm back. That was weird. Am I still streaming? I don't know. I've never had that happen before. Okay. Hopefully that didn't last too long. But it seems like I'm reconnected. Okay. Not sure what happened there. Anyway. Teresa de Lauretis' redefinition of experience exposes the workings of this ideology. Experience, she writes, is the process by which, for all social beings, subjectivity is constructed. Through that process, one places oneself or is placed in social reality, and so perceives and comprehends as subjective, referring to, originating in oneself, those relations, material, economic, and interpersonal, which are in fact social, in a larger perspective, historical. And you're like, what are you talking about? What is historical about who I am? Well, I mean, that might feel kind of weird. And a lot of people really don't like this. A lot of people really, really react pretty negatively to this critical idea that who we are is not something that is natural. And there's arguments. Not everybody agrees even what that means. People who might agree with that sentence might interpret it in very different ways. But you might say something like, well, I'm just kind of naturally someone who is introverted or extroverted. These are things that I hear about a lot. It's like, well, those ideas, introverted and extroverted, have a very particular historical discourse that they come out of. Again, psychoanalysis, but specifically, I believe, Jungian psychoanalysis. It's like, okay, well, I don't know anything about Jungian psychoanalysis, but I know I'm an introvert. But once you kind of identify yourself that way, you're invoking this whole discourse that goes in a particular direction in how it conceives of relations of people, rather than saying that someone is, let's say, reserved. We were doing this in my business speaking class the other day. We were talking about the difference between these things that might seem like synonyms. Someone who's reserved that's a different thing to say someone's reserved than to say that they're introverted. Now, I'm introverted is like a quality of who I am as a being. It's an aspect of my identity that's kind of unchangeable, at least by me. That's a very different way of conceiving of things. And so I've adopted a kind of historical discourse that allows me to conceive of myself that way. Okay, so there's a lot, that might not be the best example, but the process that De Laurentiis, I don't really know how to say that name, describes operates crucially through differentiation. Its effect is to constitute subjects as fixed and autonomous, and who are considered reliable sources of a knowledge that comes from access to the real by means of their experience. So this is like when people are online, as the child of immigrants, whatever I say after that is now validated because my experience has authority. And okay, that's the topic of this section, right? The authority of experience. Because I have an identity, because I have this sure identity, my experience becomes authoritative. And a lot of people are really invested on that. A lot of people from different kinds of political perspectives are invested in that particular argumentative strategy. And for someone to kind of disagree with that would be a violation of their sense of identity. So there's a lot. I think this thing that she's talking about, as I was saying last night, is even more relevant today. I think that there's a lot of discourse where the authority of experience, not just in the academy, not just among historians, all over social media, is one of the primary ways that people relate to issues of public concern, to kind of things that are controversial, things that we're talking about. My experience gives me authority to speak on this. When talking about historians and other students of the human sciences, it is important to note that this subject is both the object of inquiry, the person one studies in the present and the past, and the investigator, him or herself, the historian who produces knowledge of the past based on experience in the archives, or the anthropologist who produces knowledge of other cultures based on experience as a participant observer. The concepts of experience described by Williams preclude inquiry into processes of subject construction. They avoid examining the relationships between discourse, cognition, and reality, the relevance of the position or situatedness of subjects to the knowledge they produce, and the effects of difference on knowledge. Questions are not raised about, for example, whether it matters for the history they write that historians are men, women, white, black, straight, or gay. Instead, as Ducerteau writes, the authority of the subject of knowledge is measured by the elimination of everything concerning the speaker. So this is different from what I was talking about before. This is, I think, now the move to say who I am as a person, my position in space, my position in the world is relevant to what I see. Kind of, sometimes it's called situated knowledges, that it matters where I'm speaking from. His knowledge, reflecting as it does something apart from him, is legitimated and presented as universal, accessible to all. There's no power or politics in these notions of knowledge and experience. So this is also described by another critic, Donna Haraway, as the view from nowhere. Be like, this is just how things are. I did an empirical test. This is the way things are. It doesn't matter who I am. This is the way things are. It's objective experience. An example of the way experience establishes the authority of a historian can be found in R.G. Collingwood's Idea of History, the 1946 classic that has been required reading in historiography courses for several generations. For Collingwood, the ability of the historian to reenact past experience is tied to his autonomy, where by autonomy I mean the condition of being one's own authority, making statements or taking action on one's own initiative and not because those statements or actions are authorized or prescribed by anyone else. The question of where the historian is situated, who he is, how he is defined in relation to others, what the political effects of his history may be, never enters the discussion. Indeed, being free of these matters seems to be tied to Collingwood's definition of autonomy, an issue so critical for him that he launches into an uncharacteristic tirade about it. In his quest for certainty, the historian must not let others make up his mind for him, Collingwood insists, because to do that means giving up his autonomy as an historian and allowing someone else to do for him what, if he is a scientific thinker, that might seem strange to you, like, historian's a scientific thinker? Well, people used to kind of think that way. Sometimes in other places, like in Germany, there might still be a sense of that you're kind of, that you're working in Wissenschaft, a kind of, so, but that was more accepted back then. Be like, yeah, historians kind of are doing some kind of scientific thinking. He can only do for himself. There is no need for me to offer the reader any proof of this statement. If he knows anything of historical work, he already knows of his own experience that it is true. If he does not already know that it is true, he does not know enough about history to read this essay with any profit. Turning your readers away at the door, not a particularly charitable thing. I kind of like Collingwood, but this is why she's saying this is an uncharacteristic moment, uncharacteristic tirade. So there's something weird about this. Why is he so touchy here? Maybe because it's a soft spot in his thinking. And the best thing he can do is stop here and now. For Collingwood, it is axiomatic that experience is a reliable source of knowledge because it rests on direct contact between the historian's perception and reality. Even if the passage of time makes it necessary for the historian to imaginatively reenact events of the past. Thinking on his own means owning his own thoughts, and this proprietary relationship guarantees an individual's independence. These are my thoughts. I own them. If you talk about them, you're plagiarizing me. His ability to read the past correctly, and the authority of the knowledge he produces. The claim is not only for the historian's autonomy, but also for his originality. Here, experience grounds the identity of the researcher as an historian. Another very different use of experience can be found in E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, the book that revolutionized social and labor history. So both of these works, she's telling you that both of these works are like landmark works. If you are an Anglophone historian that is being trained, probably even today, I would imagine, on your comprehensive exams list, both of these works still appear. They are very important for kind of methodological, historiographical debates that are still happening. I don't know that for a fact, but if you're a historian, you can correct me if that's not true. Thompson specifically set out to free the concept of class from the ossified categories of Marxist structuralism. Ossified means like hardened into bone. Not very pliable anymore. For this project, experience was a key concept. We explored, Thompson writes of himself and his fellow New Left historians, both in theory and practice, those junction concepts such as need, class, and determine, by which, through the missing term experience, structure is transmuted into process, and the subject re-enters history. So, there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. It might not be necessary to kind of go through all of it. She'll do some of it for us. But one thing that might be helpful to think about here is what was structural about some of the classical Marxist ideas of class was that your identity in a class wasn't because of how you felt about things. It wasn't because of your attitudes towards things. It was because of a material relationship that you had to the mode of production, what Marxists call the mode of production at some point in history. If you own the means of production, you're part of the ruling class. You're part of, in capitalistic societies, the bourgeoisie. If you have to sell your labor in order to kind of make it by, and you're kind of operating within the means of production, you're a proletarian. You can have all sorts of different ideas, thoughts, opinions about that. You can be religious, you can be atheistic. It doesn't really matter. All that stuff is going to be affected by these relationships, but ultimately your identity comes from your relationship to the means of production, to the mode of production at a particular moment in history. And one of the papers that Thompson wrote outside of this book has an interesting title, and I think it has a question mark at the end of it, and it's Class Conflict Without Class. And he's like, well, what about these moments when people kind of like recognize, kind of come to what Marxists would call class consciousness? Is it possible that class consciousness kind of can precede some change in the mode of production? So he's trying to kind of come to this through experience, how people are talking, writing, thinking about what's happening, And so that's a little bit different from that structural approach. That's an imperfect way of describing this, but, for the time being. Thompson's notion of experience joined ideas of external influence and subjective feeling, the structural and the psychological. This gave him a mediating influence between social structure and social consciousness. For him, experience meant social being, the lived realities of social life, especially the affective domains of family and religion and the symbolic dimensions of expression. This definition separated the affective and the symbolic from the economic and the rational. People do not only experience their own ideas as ideas. People do not only experience their own experience as ideas. Within thought and its procedures, he maintained, they also experience their own experience as feeling. I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that he talks about in the Making of the English Working Class is how certain religious movements, like Methodism, became really important because, not so much because they had like some new theological idea, but because people were kind of like really moved by the way that Methodist preachers would kind of go out into the field and just kind of start speaking, be like, oh my God, we can do that? We can kind of gather here? Anyone can preach? So there is some ideas involved there, but the ideas are kind of related deeply to that intensity of feeling, and that kind of gave people a sense of who they were. Like, we're all feeling this together. We're vibing. Okay, they didn't say that, obviously. The statement grants importance to the psychological dimension of experience, and it allows Thompson to account for agency. Feeling, Thompson insists, is handled culturally as norms, familial and kinship obligations and reciprocities, as values, or through more elaborated forms within art and religious beliefs. So feeling is not just the emotion I am having at the moment, but like a cultural value that might be a kind of collective one. Or charte, cathedral, kind of is like a really elaborated form of feeling, a kind of structure of feeling, which is a term that Raymond Williams, who we were just talking about, came up with. Structures of feeling. So people are kind of trying to find these terms that negotiate between totally individualized subjective experience that is only within my head and completely objectified social reality that is independent of people's experience. What are some middle terms? These are what the people that she's talking about, I think, are trying to find. Thompson asserts the ways in which they handle experience defies prediction and escapes from the narrow definition of determination. People might feel differently. It's like doesn't necessarily follow laws of Marxist history, kind of orthodox Marxist sense of how history will progress. It's like, well, feelings are involved. And yet, in his use of it, experience, because it is ultimately shaped by relations of production, is a unifying phenomenon, overriding other kinds of diversity. Since these relations of production are common to workers of different ethnicities, religions, regions, and trades, they necessarily provide a common denominator and emerge as a more salient determinant of experience than anything else. In Thompson's use of the term, experience is the start of a process that culminates in the realization and articulation of social consciousness. In this case, a common identity of class. Being like, okay, well, you're from far away, you're from a different place, that could make us different. You're from a different religion or creed, that could make us different. But we're all kind of coming to this sermon and weeping. And that, in the way that he's approaching it, is more important. What becomes more salient is how we recognize ourselves, is like feeling the same thing. And the reasons for those feelings become a more important part of our identity than the things that might have separated us. It serves an integrating function, joining the individual and the structural, and bringing together diverse people into that coherent, totalizing whole, which is a distinctive sense of class. Experience, we have found, has in the last instance been generated in material life, has been structured in class ways, and hence social being has determined social consciousness. In this way, unequivocal and uniform identity is produced through objective circumstances. There's no reason to ask how this identity achieved predominance, if it had to. So she's spending a lot of time talking about E.P. Thompson's, as well as Collingwood's, versions of experience and how different they are. But you can kind of see that even though she's taking a lot of time and giving a lot of respect to both of these thinkers, she probably has a kind of critical agenda here. She wants to kind of go further to interrogate some of the assumptions that they're making. The unifying aspect of experience excludes whole realms of human activity by simply not counting them as experience, at least not with any consequences for social organization or politics. When class becomes an overriding identity, other subject positions are presumed by it. those of gender, for example, or in other instances of this kind, of history, race, ethnicity, and sexuality. The positions of men and women and their different relationships to politics are taken as reflections of material and social arrangements, rather than as products of class politics itself. They're part of the experience of capitalism. Instead of asking how some experiences become more salient than others, how what matters to Thompson is defined as experience, and how differences are dissolved, experience becomes itself cumulative and homogenizing, providing the common denominator on which class consciousness is built. And so she's criticizing this kind of saying of like, well, everyone had the same experiences. That's what really led them together. She's like, was that the case? How do we know? Aren't there other questions to ask? Thompson's own role in determining the salience of certain things and not others is never addressed. Although his author's voice intervenes powerfully with moral and ethical judgments about the situations he is recounting, the presentation of the experiences themselves is meant to secure their objective status. We forget that Thompson's history, like the accounts often by political organizers in the 19th century of what mattered in workers' lives, is an interpretation, a selective ordering of information that through its use of originary categories and teleological accounts, teleological means kind of directed to a specific end. So you kind of say, well, the purpose of people doing this was, it's like, well, okay. Oftentimes that's a thing that critics will look at and say, how do we know what the purpose was? Is that just you putting it there? People tend to be suspicious of that move. A particular kind of politics, it becomes the only possible politics, and a particular way of doing history as a reflection of what happened, the description of which is little influenced by the historian if, in this case, he only has the requisite moral vision that permits identification with the experiences of the workers in the past. So she's criticizing Thompson here mostly for presenting this description of workers' experience, not because she's not interested in what workers experience, but because he presents it as if he's not interpreting it, as he's not interpreting the evidence of experience, that it's just kind of another set of objective facts, just like the documentation once was for other historians. She's like, no, you're the one telling a story here. You got to account for that. Okay, in Thompson's account, class is finally an identity rooted in structural relations that pre-exist politics. What this obscures is the contradictory and contested process by which class itself was conceptualized, and by which diverse kinds of subject positions were assigned, felt, contested, or embraced. As a result, Thompson's brilliant history of the English working class, so she's like, brilliant, it's brilliant, still has something to criticize about it, which set out to historicize the category of class, ends up essentializing it. So what's this difference between historicizing and essentializing it? Essentializing, usually when critics say you are essentializing something, that's not a thing that they're complimenting you for. You're kind of taking something that is concrete, historical, contingent, and making it into something that's eternal, transcendent, true of all things. There's only one way it could have been. It's more necessary than possible. Those are kinds of problems that happen there. If you historicize something, you show all the contingency in it. Well, it could have gone this way or that way or this way. It just happened to go this way. This is just one way that it could have gone. The ground may seem to be displaced from structure to agency by insisting on the subjectively felt nature of experience. But the problem Thompson sought to address isn't really solved. Working class experience is now the ontological foundation of working class identity, politics, and history. So ontological means what makes it essential. This is just another kind of way of saying essentializing. What makes working class identity is experience. And that's where she's going back to that argument she was saying at the top about how anti-foundationalists, like E.P. Thompson, are returning to experience as their foundation. This kind of use of experience has the same foundational status if we substitute women's, or black, or lesbian, or homosexual for working class in the previous sentence. Among feminist historians, for example, experience has helped legitimize a critique of the false claims to objectivity of historical traditional accounts. Part of the project of some feminist history has been to unmask all claims to objectivity as an ideological cover for masculine bias, by pointing out the shortcomings, incompleteness, and exclusiveness of mainstream history. This has been achieved by providing documentation about women in the past that calls into question existing interpretations, made without consideration of gender. But how do we authorize the new knowledge if the possibility of all historical objectivity has been questioned? By appealing to experience, which in this usage connotes both reality and its subjective apprehension, the experience of women in the past and of women historians who can recognize something of themselves in their foremothers. Judith Newton, a literary historian writing about the neglect of feminism by contemporary critical theorists, argues that women, too, arrived at the critique of objectivity, usually associated with deconstruction or new historicism. This feminist critique came straight out of reflection on our own, that is, women's experience, out of the contradictions we felt between the different ways we were represented, even to ourselves, out of the inequities we had long experienced in our situations. She's like, it came out of us. That's where it came from. Our experience was the foundation of these insights. Newton's appeal to experience seems to bypass the issue of objectivity by not raising the question of whether feminist work can be objective, but it rests firmly on a foundational ground, experience. In her work, the relationship between thought and experience is represented as transparent. The visual metaphor combines with the visceral. This is also, I think, still pretty common, where it's like, the more visceral experience is, in some sense, the more intense its truth value is. Of course, there's another discourse that says just the opposite, being like, wow, you're just really emotional, you can't think straight, which has often been used to kind of dismiss women's voices, right? So there are these problems, and it's not like, she's not trying to say here that it's bad to appeal to experience. That's not what she's trying to say at all. She's talking about when experience becomes a foundation for a whole project of history, what's involved in doing that. As it is in historian Christine Stanzel's insistence that social practices, in all their immediacy and entirety, constitute a domain of sensuous experience, a prediscursive reality directly felt, seen, and known, that cannot be subsumed by language. And this is one of the reasons I really like this piece, is because this is a really difficult kind of position to get an angle on. And it comes up a lot where people are like, they talk about the immediacy of what they experience, and not only that, but that it can't be put into words. So that the truth that they have can't be communicated to you. You wouldn't understand. You haven't experienced it. So the burden is on you to understand yourself, but also there's no way that you can, because you don't have the right experiences. And part of the reason that's difficult is because it's difficult. It's like, that does kind of feel true, doesn't it? How could you possibly understand what it's like to be someone else? Someone who's from a very different place than you. Someone who has a very different kind of social identity than you. How could you understand that in the way that they do, viscerally, in their life? Okay, so what can we say? Here's what she's going to try to do for us. The effect of these kinds of statements, which attribute an indisputable authenticity to women's experience, is to establish incontrovertibly women's identity as people with agency. It is also to universalize the identity of women, and thus to ground claims for the legitimacy of women's history in the shared experience of historians of women, and those women whose stories they tell. In addition, it literally equates the personal with the political, for the lived experience of women is seen as leading directly to resistance to oppression, that is, to feminism. Indeed, the possibility of politics is said to rest on, or to follow from, a pre-existing women's experience. So you see the criticism she's making is like, okay, if feminist historians are appealing to women's experience, how do you know what a woman is? Is that kind of obvious? Is that something that doesn't require criticism? I think today it may be even more obvious because it's happening in public, this debate about who is a woman. And there are feminists and feminist historians, former academic feminist historians, who have kind of, whose position seems to kind of have remained the same in light of this question. Someone like Germaine Greer, who wrote The Female Eunuch, this kind of radical feminist text that today is like, said some very things that could be interpreted as bigoted against trans people, against trans women especially. So how universal can we make our categories when we appeal to experience? That in some sense takes off a certain kind of critical pressure from the historian, even as they appear to be doing more critical work than the people that they're arguing with. And at a certain point, are any of those other people still around? Are you still really arguing with the people that are like, no? I mean, those people are kind of like maybe writing popular history books and things like that. But professional historians maybe already all accept these arguments. And can you still keep making this argument against imaginary enemies? Okay. Because of its drive toward a political massing together of women, writes Denise Riley, feminism can never wholeheartedly dismantle women's experience, however much this category conflates the attributed, the imposed, and the lived, and then sanctifies the resulting mélange. So it's like, if our experience is in some sense put upon us, you have to do these things as a woman. But it's also things that are kind of lived, that are kind of real to you as someone, things that you discover despite all the things that are imposed on your lives, the things that are kind of gaps. If we put that all together in the same category, which means by conflating all of these things together, it kind of sanctifies in a weird way some of the stuff that you're trying to fight against. Be like, well, that's my experience as a woman. It's like, well, maybe some of those experiences are part of the problem. They're things that are imposed on people. Where in Bangladesh, for instance, I'm not a big fan of microfinance, personally, but I think the story is interesting. When Muhammad Yunus, the founder of Green Bank, went to Bangladesh to establish microfinance there, he had a kind of gender quota of 50-50, to give loans, microfinance loans to women at 50% of the rate they give it to men. And initially, they felt like the field workers came back like it's impossible. Because women will be like, well, I'm a woman, I don't know anything about money. Be like, you have to talk to my husband about it. Like, I do the business, like I'm going to run the business, but you have to talk to my husband about the money. And maybe that's true in their experience. They have not yet in their lives dealt with money. So there you could be like, well, that's their experience. And so there they kind of had to come up with another strategy of like being a little bit more, trying to be persuasive. And eventually they were successful to where they had way more than 50% of women being the kind of signatories on these loans. Okay. That's a weird example, but I don't know. That's the one that comes to mind. The kind of argument for a women's history and for a feminist politics that Riley criticizes closes down inquiry into the ways in which female subjectivity is produced, the ways in which agency is made possible, the way in which race and sexuality intersect with gender, the ways in which politics organize and interpret experience. In sum, the ways in which identity is a contested terrain, the site of multiple and conflicting claims. In Riley's words, it masks the likelihood that experiences have accrued to women not by virtue of their womanhood alone, but as traces of domination, whether natural or political. I would add that it masks the necessarily discursive character of these experiences as well. So not only does it kind of like naturalize all of your experiences, being like, I'm having this experience as a woman. It's also that when you talk about your experience, it's like, well, you have to use language. And that kind of changes things, doesn't it? That can't go away. It's not like language is not a perfect medium. Just like with Delaney, vision is not a kind of perfect, open, transparent medium. Neither is language, certainly not. Maybe even less. But it's precisely the discursive character of experience that is at issue for some historians, because attributing experience to discourse seems somehow to deny its status as an unquestionable ground of explanation. And I would say here, I think one of the other things that she's kind of getting at is why some people are reluctant to do that is like, well, if you criticize experience as a grounds of evidence, you're siding with the enemy. You're siding with people that want to say you have to have real documentation of all of this stuff. And if you don't, tough luck. And people are like, okay, well, what happens when a colonial power burns all of the records, as the English did when, after their Kenyan massacres, or after the Belgians did of what they did in the Congo? Like, what happens when even whatever record they were like actually destroyed? Does that mean that that's just not history now? What can we say about it? What kind of historical work can be done when no records were kept, no documents were kept, records were destroyed? What do we do? Do we want history to kind of just take that shape? And I don't think that's what she's saying, but I think that's kind of the defensiveness that some people have. We have to kind of like all get together and defend experience as an unquestionable ground, because if we concede anything about it, we're going to give in to the enemy. And she's like, actually, you're making it weaker. You're making the kind of history that you want to write not as powerful as it would be, because it's not attending to the critical questions that are involved. So it's a debate happening amongst different kinds of historical criticism. That's really what this is about. But it's precisely the discursive character experience that is at issue for some historians, because attributing experience to discourse seems somehow to deny it a status as an unquestionable ground of explanation. This seems to be the case for John Toes, I don't know if that's how you say it, but John Toast, let's go with that, who wrote a long article in the American Historical Review in 1987 called Intellectual History After the Linguistic Turn: The Autonomy of Meaning and the Irreducibility of Experience. The term linguistic turn is a comprehensive one used by Toes to refer to approaches to the study of meaning that draw on a number of disciplines, but especially on theories of language, since the primary medium of meaning was obviously language. The question for Toes is how far linguistic analysis has gone and should go, especially in view of the post-structuralist challenge to foundationalism. Reviewing a number of books that take on questions of meaning and its analysis, Toes concludes that the predominant tendency among intellectual historians is to adapt traditional historical concerns for extra-linguistic origins, and reference to the semiological challenge, semiological meaning like about signs and meaning and stuff, to reaffirm in new ways that in spite of the relative autonomy of cultural meanings, human subjects still make and remake worlds of meaning in which they are suspended, and to insist that these worlds are not creations ex nihilo, out of nothing, but responses to and shapings of changing worlds of experience, ultimately irreducible to the linguistic forms in which they appear. It's like, experience is underneath language. It's more foundational. It's more basic. Don't say it's all about language. Language comes after experience. This is the position he's putting forward. By definition, he argues, history is concerned with explanation. It is not a radical hermeneutics. Hermeneutics being a kind of science of understanding or interpretation. Not really a science, but, a practice, but an attempt to account for the origin, persistence, and disappearance of certain meanings at particular times and in specific sociocultural situations. For him, explanation requires a separation of experience and meaning. Experience is that reality which demands meaningful response. So I have an experience, the fact that I'm having that experience is a fact, and then I interpret it. That's kind of his position he's putting forward. And you can already tell that Scott is not going to agree with that. Be like, there is no experience unless you're already interpreting it. There's no distance. You can't. There's no moment where you can be like, well, let me look at the world without interpreting it. Maybe under the effects of certain drugs. I would say, maybe there's a way in which you'd be like, I don't know the names of anything anymore. I'm just seeing stuff. Maybe that's possible, but would we really call that experience? Once you kind of are looking around and be like, oh yeah, these things are important, these things are not. I know the names of these things. I see things in a certain way. There's interpretation already embedded, even in your perception of the world. Even in that kind of so-called immediate experience that you're having. It's already being mediated by language, history, habit, discourse, social positioning, blah, 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 blah. That's all already happening. So for Scott, there is no immediate experience. There is no immediate experience. Everything is mediated. The absence of definition allows experience to reduce... Sorry, I'm getting a lot of text because people want to talk to me. But, I'm going to keep going with this. The absence of definition allows experience to resonate in many ways, but it also allows it to function as a universally understood category. The undefined word creates a sense of consensus by attributing to it an assumed, stable, and shared meaning. Experience for Toes is a foundational concept. While recognizing that meanings differ and that the historian's task is to analyze the different meanings produced in societies and over time, Toes protects experience from this kind of relativism. In doing so, he establishes the possibility for objective knowledge and communication among historians, however diverse their positions and views. This has the effect, among others, of removing historians from critical scrutiny as active producers of knowledge. It's like, what you're doing as history it's just like, I'm just doing it. What do you want from me? I'm a historian. And she's like, no, we should be asking ourselves what we were doing when we're doing history all the time. The insistence on the separation of meaning and experience is crucial for Toes, not only because it seems the only way to account for change, but also because it protects the world from the hubris of word makers who claim to be makers of reality. You're just saying stuff. You're just a word maker. I love that. Just a word maker. You're not really making reality. You're just describing it, right? This is a common attitude. Even if Toes here uses word makers metaphorically to refer to those who produce texts, those who engage in signification, his opposition between words and reality echoes the distinction he makes earlier in the article between language or meaning and experience. This opposition guarantees both an independent status for human agents and the common ground on which they can communicate and act. It produces a possibility for intersubjective communication among individuals despite differences between them, and also reaffirms their existence as thinking beings outside the discursive practices they devise and employ. Toes is critical of J.G.A. Pocock's vision of intersubjective communication based on rational consensus in a community of free individuals, all of whom are equally masters of their own wills. Pocock's theories, he writes, often seem like theoretical reflections of familiar practices because the world they assume is also the world in which many contemporary Anglo-American historians live or think they live. Yet the separation of meaning and experience that Toes offers does not really provide an alternative. A more diverse community can be posited, of course, with different meanings given to experience. Since the phenomenon of experience itself can be analyzed outside the meanings given to it, the subjective position of historians then can seem to have nothing to do with the knowledge they produce. In this way, experience authorizes historians, and it enables them to counter the radical historicist stance that, Toes says, undermines the traditional historian's quest for unity, continuity, and purpose by robbing them of any standpoint from which a relationship between past, present, and future could be, note the word here, objectively reconstructed. Because that's ultimately why we have to be after these foundations. How do you get to an objectivity in knowledge without some kind of foundational, agreed upon, unquestionable thing? Well, you could argue that the objectivity of knowledge is not the only value of knowledge. There might be value in a knowledge that is not objective. But, okay. Here he establishes as self-evident and unproblematic the reflective nature of historical representation. So when people say unproblematic or problematic in critical discourse, this might be worth pausing to think about. Because today people online will be like, that's problematic. And what they mean is basically, that's bad. It's almost not... It's a related meaning to where it came from, which again is, I think, out of academic critical discourse. When someone in critical discourse says that something is problematic, they're not saying that it's bad. They're saying that it's something that we can ask questions about, that something that we shouldn't make maybe the normal or average assumptions about. And so when they problematize something, which is something a lot of critics will describe themselves doing, I'm problematizing this, they're not just trying to make it bad. They're trying to open it up to different perspectives. So when someone treats something as unproblematic, they're just kind of take it as common sense. They're not doing that. Okay. Attention to experience, he concludes. So that results in the fact that usually when a critic is describing someone else as unproblematic or doing something unproblematically, they're not approving of it. Even though it would seem like, unproblematic, good. They're like, no. Clearly, they should be asking questions about this, and they're not doing that. So they're being kind of like lazy, or they're hiding something, or they're like, maybe that's a little bit too harsh. I'm moralizing it. They're just not asking questions that are important. Attention to experience, he concludes, is essential for our self-understanding, and thus also for fulfilling the historian's task of connecting memory with hope. Well, that sounds nice. I think it's good to read these long footnotes, but given how long this already is, I'm not going to do that in this particular one. I would if I were reading it myself, but I'm not going to do it today. Toe's experience thus provides an object for historians that can be known apart from their own role as meaning makers, and it then guarantees not only the objectivity of their knowledge, but their ability to persuade others of its importance. Whatever diversity and conflict may exist among them, Toe's community of historians is rendered homogeneous by its shared object, experience. But as Ellen Rooney has so effectively pointed out, using the field of literary theory as her example, this kind of homogeneity can exist only because of the exclusion of the possibility that, quote, historically irreducible interests divide and define reading communities. Inclusiveness is achieved by denying that exclusion is inevitable, that difference is established through exclusion, and that the fundamental differences that accompany inequalities of power and position cannot be overcome by persuasion. In Toe's article, no disagreement about the meaning of the term experience can be entertained, since experience itself lies somehow outside its signification. For that reason, perhaps Toe's never defines it. Even among those historians who do not share all of Toe's ideas about the objectivity or continuous quality of history writing, the definitions or the defense of experience works in much the same way. It establishes a realm of reality outside of discourse and authorizes the historian, who has access to it. The evidence of experience works as the foundation, providing both a starting point and a conclusive kind of explanation, beyond which few questions can or need be asked. And yet it is precisely the questions precluded, questions about discourse, difference, and subjectivity, as well as about what counts as experience and who gets to make that determination, that would enable us to historicize experience and to reflect critically on the history we write about, rather than to premise our history on it. Okay, so this might seem like a long argument. I probably will stop here. I'll probably come back later today and finish the piece on this third section, historicizing experience. And this is going to be like what she wants us to do. She's like, rather than assuming experience as a foundation for thinking about history or thinking about anything, really, experience needs to become the object of history, one of the objects of history. How do we historicize it? How do we show that the way that subjectivity is constructed, the way that experiences are felt, what makes certain kinds of experiences possible, legible, understandable, and others not at certain moments in time? How does that come to be? That's a different kind of historical project. That's what she's going to try to get to. But I'm going to stop here just because I have these phone calls to make. I'll come back to this letter. But let me say this about what she's trying to say here. It's not just in history, as I was saying yesterday, that this kind of problem comes up. It's all over the place. It's very difficult to maintain the position that she's asking us to maintain, which is to say, there is nothing before in writing about stuff in human history and culture that comes before interpretation. There's nothing that comes before us being in language. You cannot say, okay, well, people have experiences or people have thoughts, and then they put them into language. Because once you do that, you kind of created a fictional position that someone's ability to experience or think things could happen without them already being a social historical subject. It's not, so she wants to kind of say, well, if we don't do that, we don't have any foundations. We don't have there's nothing foundational about our discourse. And for some people, that kind of would delegitimize it. But for her, I think, and I think for a lot of critics, assuming a foundation actually makes your discourse less legitimate, because a foundation isn't really the solid rock basis of what you're saying, but just something that you're putting as being beyond question. If everything is open to question, there is no kind of obvious starting point for historical criticism or criticism of any kind. There's no obvious place where you can start. So you have to just be persuasive all of the time. You yourself, it matters where you're coming from. It matters what kind of language you're using. It matters who your audience is. It's much more rhetorical. And if for someone is like, well, that's not scientific, right. Criticism, in the way that she's imagining it, is not science, at least as imagined by many people, as being something that has objective certainty to it at its end result. I don't think that's a good way of imagining science either. Personally, I don't think that. But it's definitely not a good way of trying to understand criticism or to do criticism. It's trying to find the things that are absolutely certain. Criticism is an act of interpretation, among other things. It's an act of interpretation. And saying that, well, within my act of interpretation, there are certain things I don't have to interpret, or certain things that no one else is allowed to interpret, is kind of like a cheap trick, or a very expensive one. Thanks for tuning in. I will try to come back today. This actually was a lot shorter than last night. My sense of time at night is different. I'm like, oh, let me just go on a sidebar about this, and I'll go on a sidebar for like 40 minutes. So in the day, I'm a little bit more concise, it turns out. But I'll come back to this, we'll finish it, and we'll talk about historicizing experience later on today on the Rhetoric Prof stream. Thanks for tuning in. See you soon.